Okay, I think we're more or less ready to go. So yeah, we'll get started. Obviously, we've got some time today to just talk about the business case for Salesforce DevOps and why it's important to embrace DevOps as part of a DevOps transformation that's sort of taking place within your organization and pretty much in every organization. So yeah, speaking today is just going to be me. My name is Jack Weatherly. I'm lead account executive at Gearset. You may have been expecting Kevin, our CEO and co-founder, to join the call as well. Unfortunately, he's had something else come up, as things do, I guess, when you're CEO. But I'll run you through this today. As any questions pop up, please do pop them in the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on that and answer things as we go. It looks like we've got quite a small number of attendees today, which is actually a good thing, to be honest. In lots of cases, it means really can dig into some questions and some scenarios and use cases for you. Just a bit about my background. I started at Gearset, about 3.5 years ago when Gearset was made up of probably about 9 people, I think it was. Really built out the sales team since then. Don't worry too much though. The sales role that we have really is probably more in line with a pre-sales engineer or technical engineer that you might see elsewhere. So very much more on that technical side for today as well. So very briefly, just a bit about Gearset. So I appreciate lots of people on the call today will be familiar with Gearset. Some of you might not. So Gearset in brief is a release management tool for Salesforce. We spun out of actually a larger DevOps company that work on other platforms about 5 years ago now. They adopted Salesforce. They saw that being in that DevOps industry, an ecosystem, the solutions out of the box weren't tailored to their requirements, shall I say. Things like change sets not quite delivering the value that they needed. That turned into a project internally. That internal project obviously had some good results and some good progress, and they turned that into a spin-off business. And that's how we got to Gearset as it is today. So we offer essentially a full suite of DevOps solutions, so ranging from metadata migration and compare, data migration, data backup, and obviously some other things in between. We work with some of the largest companies in the world, really to just improve that DevOps experience overall. Typically, people do use change sets around to begin with, and then move through that process, picking up Gearset and other tools and processes along the way. We normally see a sort of a speed of those releases sort of being increased by about 10 times, 8 to 10 times. So taking things down from a day to an hour is quite a common scenario. As a whole, though, we cover really every part of DevOps. So you should just need to essentially pick up Gearset as a one-stop shop for all those requirements. So there's a few key concepts that we'll talk about today. I appreciate these are very basic to begin with. Everybody's going to be familiar with them, but it's worth talking about them, sort of how they fit into this project. DevOps is a pretty obvious one, as I said, but really it is that idea of combining and bringing together the admins and devs to actually build that configuration, that customization on the Salesforce platform, and get them to work really closely with the people who are responsible for the deployment of those changes. In lots of organizations, that'll actually be the same people, in which case you're pretty inherently tied into that DevOps model. But in lots of larger teams, you will have admins and devs and dedicated release managers, and bringing those people together is really what this process is about. Digital transformation is, I guess, is the larger umbrella that this sits under. The adoption of digital technology to transform services and businesses, typically in our case, replacing manual processes. I'm pretty sure we're using Salesforce. Non-digital doesn't really apply. But those manual processes that sit on top of Salesforce, replacing those with automated processes. And to be honest, as Salesforce grows within your business, probably are going to be replacing some non-digital processes as well. So it's really the umbrella that DevOps and what we're talking about today sits under. Agile development is really the framework, I guess, for lots of the benefits and lots of the ways of working that we'll talk about. Really, the idea of Agile is to break up large projects into significantly smaller pieces of work and then tackling those one by one and delivering them to the customer in those smaller pieces. So continually improving and releasing changes. It gives us loads of benefits. The biggest one is going to be flexibility. So we don't have to deliver everything in one go. We can start, get a few pieces out, and then move on to something else if our priorities change. Today's talk is going to cover a few topics here. The first one's just sort of creating the vision, I guess, the plan, what are you actually going to be doing, and really how do you get engagement within your organization for this idea of DevOps. Next up, we'll look at targeting value nice and early. So no project in any company is going to plan not to see value for any significant period of time. But really what we want to do here is DevOps is going to be a long-term initiative and engagement. And we need to see value early on in that process to make sure that the business is happy, that our teams, admins and devs are happy with the progress that's being made, and that the buy-in continues to grow. We will have a look briefly at how GearSet handles DevOps internally. Some interesting things that we do, some interesting stories there, so we'll touch on that. And then we'll go down, once we've seen our internal model, at some of the things that you can do to really get started down this route as well. So we'll get started here. I expect we'll run for about 30 or 40 minutes, and we'll leave some good time at the end for questions. As they pop up again, I'll try and grab those and address them as well. So as we said at the beginning, we want to create that value, that vision as early on as possible. And by having a clear plan of how we're going to approach DevOps, we can make sure that that happens. A really important first step to that is understanding your starting point. This is really the foundations that we want to build off, and knowing where you actually sit at the moment is really integral to that. Most of the people that we work with really are in that sort of levels 1 up to about level 3. By the time people are in level 4 or 5, they're very, very advanced, probably already using either GearSet or another tool on the market. And so we don't have too many of those conversations, sort of new customers. This is just an example and really a template for you to build off of, but it can be very helpful to identify, the tools that you're using, maybe change sets. Maybe you've got a backup. How are you working with other people in the team, collaborating, to really identify actually what that starting point looks like. The important thing to note is we're not going to try and get everybody from level 1 to level 5. That's absolutely not the case or the goal with DevOps here. We want to take everybody from their starting position up to what their business requires them to get to. Anything beyond that is essentially superfluous. It's going to be additional cost, additional time that nobody needs. So we just need to get to that level that delivers the optimum business value. Within that, we want to start targeting really quantifiable outcomes. So before we start the project at all, setting those measurable targets allows us to assess whether we're going down the right path. We talked about Agile methodology before. This gives us something to track that against, to understand how well we're doing and whether we need to make any changes. So we had that example before of improving the time it takes to do a release from 8 hours down to an hour. That's a nice quantifiable outcome that we can look for. Maybe to shorten our release cadence, sort of from once a month to once a week. These are things that we can easily identify, easily measure, and they can demonstrate that value for us quite well. So releasing faster is probably the biggest pain point that we get from anybody who comes to GearSet. They use change sets. It takes them ages to actually do a release. And the problem with that is that the longer you spend doing the deployment, doing the release, the less time you're actually spending building config, writing code, and actually delivering that value, that part of the job that you're really paid to do, delivering value to the business. So releasing faster is a huge value add. The next thing that we sort of tend to hear about is improving deployment reliability. When you're looking at the value of DevOps, you don't just need to look at how long it takes you to release a single release. You really need to look at how long, start to finish, it takes you to move those components. So if you're talking about change sets, often they can be quite quick if the set of changes are small, but if you have validation errors, dependency problems, you have to build that package multiple times and keep trying, then that start to finish time gets quite long on average. And that's something that you can address with improved reliability. Releasing more often is, of course, a nice benefit as well. Releasing more often is neither here nor there in and of itself. The real benefit you get from releasing more often is that the amount of changes, config and code that you're pushing with each release is smaller. So each release in and of itself is less risky. There's less change, there's fewer moving parts. And if something does go wrong, that makes it easier to identify what the problem was. You also get some really nice benefits in terms of sort of customer feedback as well. That's more specific to a small set of changes rather than being, just a general approval or disapproval of a whole host of changes, which is less actionable. The last thing about releasing really often is that, and as contradictory as this may sound, is that your app is more stable from a UI perspective. It doesn't change all that much. Things move ever so slightly on a regular basis, but you don't have wholesale change, which can confuse users, move things about the app, once a quarter, let's say. So it gives you that stability as well. The last thing is decreasing costs. That might be a goal. At the end of the day, every organization, time is money. If you're spending time, people hours on these deployments, that's going to cost you, whether it's a direct cost or an opportunity cost that you're missing out on something else that you could have worked on. It's going to play a part, and decreasing those costs, improving that efficiency there, may lead to an increased budget and more scope to pick up more projects, all sorts of benefits and opportunities to work on other things. So identifying key goals is something you'll want to look at next. So outcomes are really the end, sort of that finish line, if you were. We want to deliver value to our customers faster. It's an outcome. A goal is something sort of shorter term, have lots of them, and they'll build up towards that outcome as a whole. That's where we see this idea of DevOps as a journey. There's lots of goals along the way. This is a model that we actually use internally for people management, talking about progression, improving skill sets and knowledge when setting goals, but it actually applies perfectly here as well to this scenario. So the goals we want to set for ourselves need to be specific. We need to know exactly what we're working towards. They need to be measurable. You touched on that a second ago. You need to be able to understand that progress easily and clearly. They need to be attainable. This is something that for goals specifically becomes really important. Whereas the outcomes, probably a bit less specific and targeted. These need to be really attainable. Relevant is really quite obvious, and time-based as well. This again is where that idea of being agile comes in. Time framing these individual goals to assess whether we're reaching them or not, whether we're on track, and whether we need to change those goals to find something that we can deliver in a shorter period of time to get that value sooner. A question that's come in here that sort of quick and easy to answer is what would be a good or normal pace to release? Once a day, once a week, once a month. This depends entirely on your organization, your requirements that sort of sit behind that, and your customer base as well. So we'll see in a second, GearSet releases twice a day because we find that that's best for us. It's really quick and really easy. if you're in an exceptionally heavily regulated industry, you might have to go through all sorts of approvals for every single release. So when we look at those industries, we tend to see longer release cycles. That's generally a hindrance and something we want to avoid if we don't need to. So I'd always say to bring that in as short as you can without it becoming a burden, essentially. So if you think about maybe once a week, once a fortnight, that's usually a good target for how often you want to release. Confirming the value is something else you want to put into your planning stage here. So we want to be able to have a process in place which allows us to confirm that what we're doing is actually offering value to the business. DevOps is going to be an investment, usually in time within the business, and we need to know that we are staying on track. Obviously, the goals are helpful there, but you do need to be open to changing and shifting things up. So if those goals that you're reaching aren't actually delivering any tangible value to you, then you might need to change up those goals. Be open to changing the metrics as well. If you're finding that they're not particularly measurable or it's hard to measure them, month to month, you can change those up. This process of reviewing goals and metrics, I generally recommend to happen every 2 to 4 weeks, really just to make sure you're on track. If you go too soon, you probably haven't made too much progress. If you go too long, there is a risk that you go down the wrong avenue. And again, going straight to level 5, going immediately for an outcome instead of those shorter-term goals is going to lead to a sort of disconnect where the goals and metrics aren't delivering the value that you need. Another question here about our release process, just about whether there's a service interruption when we deploy. Interesting story. So when we released GitSet initially 5 years ago, there was, and that was one of our really important outcomes that we needed to get to change that as part of our DevOps journey. So nowadays there's no disruption at all, and we'll see how we actually achieve that later on as well. So when you have a bit of a plan in place, you need to start essentially approaching this DevOps engagement, I guess, commitment, by targeting value really nice and early on. We talked about this with short-term goals. We'll see it a bit more in detail here. When we look at getting the ball rolling, starting the process, really considering what our first options are, what we want to do, you want to bring your biggest challenges to the forefront, put a target on the back. And that's what we did with disruptions for our deployments. We knew that was something that we needed to address. And you have to really review whether your goals that you've set out for yourself, whether they address that in a time frame that you're happy with. Once you've actually got that biggest challenge identified and in place, then you want to break it down into some smaller pieces. So tackling areas which deliver the most immediate value for you, the team, the end users, the customer can be useful. So in Salesforce, it might be new integration, pulling in data from an external system that the sales team have been dying for ages, just updating some up-to-date profiles so people can get access to what they need. It really could be anything. For us, it was determining in what order we wanted our services to be automatically continued after a release. Our data deployments, our metadata deployments, our metadata comparisons, they're all separate. So after a release, we needed to decide, well, which one do we want to resume first? Which is the bite-sized piece that we tackle? And for us, the most important thing was the metadata deployments at the time. So that's the piece that we tackled first. Getting these wins early on demonstrates a lot of value internally. It can cement executive buy-in to the project, which can really help get things off the ground, especially in larger organizations. Also confirms the team's engagement as well. Really make sure that they're happy to give it their all. We really don't want to be going into this with a team that's hesitant, holding back, still wants to be working on change sets and not changing the way they work. So early value and early wins is important. When we start looking at what we actually want to address first, we'll quickly identify there's always going to be compromises in what we're approaching. And before we actually start that engagement, that process of doing all these things, we just need to know what those pros and cons are. Very much more so the cons at this point. We've understood the pros. Those fall into our goals, our outcomes. This is why we're here. Reducing our error risks, releasing fixes or updates more quickly, CI, delivering value sooner, backups, deployment success rate. These are all the things we've already addressed. What we need to highlight, though, is there will be some cons associated with those. So there might be some teething pains in your release process. Maybe change sets aren't super efficient at the moment, but they get the release out on time. As you start changing, maybe there'll be some teething pains and you'll have a release that goes out late. There'll be some additional process complexity. Adding new tools, new processes, that might be seen as a compromise. Maybe some financial investment into more people, additional tools. There might be some skills or knowledge that's required to actually get this off the ground. At the end of the day, just committing more people and time might actually cost you something in terms of opportunity cost, features that can't be developed right now because you're working on your DevOps process. All of these, quite clearly, in the vast majority of cases will outweigh or be outweighed by the pros, the advantages of doing this. But you have to be aware of them. You have to address them before you can really move forwards. So what I'd say is pick your battles wisely, especially when that executive buy-in is still fragile. Choose the path of least resistance. If there are massive disadvantages, you need to do 2 weeks of training with an entire team, maybe start somewhere else with somebody on the team who's more engaged, who's more interested in pursuing this just out of interest, rather than because you're pushing the change. And make sure that you mitigate, any cons that do pop up. You might find that your immediate requirements for the value you have to deliver come with some pretty heavy consequences. So just address those with additional resources, documentation, training, enablement, all of those things. We talked about it with aiming for level 5. Don't try and implement a perfect solution from day one. That won't give you space to change or address compromises, or to make compromises to address the cons either. And it probably will lead to delivery interruption or to poor adoption within the team. It's an interesting little diagram. I appreciate there's very little scientific value to this, but the idea when we start kicking off a DevOps process is we want it to be evolution, not revolution. Each of these lines really representing the engagement and the commitment from the team and the business. If we come in with strong ideas, huge changes from day one, we get this massive spike of information, and then all of this hesitation, this lack of engagement, this friction within the team, and probably a slower adoption after that because we're fighting an uphill battle again. With the evolution, this slow change over time, we're giving value in nice small increments, and we're building on that engagement. Pretty simple. And as I said, there's very little scientific value in this, but I did quite like the illustration. The other thing we might want to understand early on before we actually start a process is some of the additional value points that DevOps can deliver, just so we don't miss the boat on them, essentially. There's a few things here that are really important to capitalize on, as we start making changes, and they might not always be really obvious given the goals and outcomes that we've set ourselves. They can be sort of secondary benefits. The first one is short feedback cycles. So make sure that as we're pushing these small slices of features, that we get that feedback from the customers or the end users in lots of cases as soon as possible. Addressing that feedback when it comes in relating to specific changes allows us to undo things early on if the end users aren't happy, or to double down and be really agile and sort of aggressively, add to those features that get the best feedback. So that's one thing to really engage with and to make sure that we get the most value from. Scalability is going to be something as well that may well in lots of cases be a primary objective, but if it isn't, it is something that you're building towards that can be very useful for the team. It stops you hitting any kind of roadblocks as that team grows. For almost everybody here, I'm sure that Salesforce is not getting any smaller in terms of its footprint in your organization. And that means that your team isn't going to be getting any smaller either. So that scalability is really, really important, and it can save you from significant pains down the line. The last one here is one that is quite often overlooked, actually, especially by teams who want to get to that perfect solution straight away. And this is the upskilling of the team that's involved. DevOps, as a whole is a whole set of skills, whole set of knowledge and information. And the team that really gets to build on this gets to pick up all that information. It's really powerful in terms of retention within the team, but it's also a powerful lever for business success. You've got an entire team now with significantly better skills, more engagement, and you're probably going to get better delivery and results from that as well. So not always sort of tracked, I guess. It's unlikely to be a goal or a targeted outcome, but it can have big business benefits down the line as well. The last thing that's really important just to have in mind as well is protecting the value that you end up implementing. So backup is really important. We can go through this entire process, but if you lose it and start, have to start again, we're not going to be in a good place. You insure your home, your car, all of these things, and as a business, you want to do that with this investment into DevOps and for the metadata and data that comes of it. You need to back up both metadata and data. It is really important. Losing any or all of either of those can have huge consequences, so just make sure that you're covering both of those. And the other piece of backup, which is probably more interesting for this conversation, to be honest, is that having those backups that you trust and a restore process that you believe in means you can be more aggressive with the changes that you make. You know how to roll back and undo changes very quickly, very efficiently. And with that comes the confidence then to make aggressive changes, to push at the speed that the business probably wants you to. And that's probably the most important part that comes from having backup in place. It's a little anecdote. I think this was from one of the sort of Salesforce Reddits, basically. But just how easy it is to lose data. Somebody tried to load up some records. Essentially, they made a quick mistake. They tried to delete those few records and ended up deleting a whole host more from the org. The bit that made this really bad was actually that they didn't notice for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then they really had some problems getting that data back. So it is easy to do. Just keep this in mind. It's probably something you want to consider early on. It's just protecting this investment you might be making. So we can move on to a bit of an internal case study now, just see how GearSet handles all these things really. And I guess this answers some of those questions that came up in a bit more detail as well. You can take a quick sip of water and we can jump into this one. So we're about 5 years into our DevOps journey, and we'll show you a little bit about the changes that have happened internally over that time. So back in 2015, the entirety of our release process was manual, essentially, and we checked the logs actively to see how busy the app was. Did we have a customer or two making changes, running comparisons, deployments? And if we did, we would actively wait to do our release. Let them finish. It could be 2-3 hours if they had a big project going. And we sit there watching the logs until they went quiet. And then we'd very quickly try and get all of these manual processes done to release the app before the next customer logged on. Very much manual and a real pain having to wait, between jobs running. Everything in terms of pre and post deployment checks were all manual as well. So it took, probably a few hours in terms of the actual manual processes, but then it could have taken a few hours on top of that, just waiting for the app to be quiet as well. I probably feel quite familiar, people having to sort of do deployments in the evenings or over the weekend, when Salesforce is quieter as well. So we targeted some quantifiable outcomes here. And this was really our set of outcomes and goals that we wanted to work towards. So uptime was crucial. This was the non-negotiable one. We had to allow our customers to keep using the tool while we were releasing updates. That's something we really had to work on. And that was our primary goal, essentially the first thing we addressed. After that, we came to scalability. We knew we'd have to be able to release more often without it becoming a time sink. Very conscious, working in the DevOps space, that this was something we wanted to prioritize. We also wanted to get feedback to be brought in quickly as well. So as a relatively new tool at the time, we weren't 100% sure of the market needs, market requirements. So getting that tool feedback in very, very quickly and then iterating immediately from that was a big priority as well. And the final thing was ease of use. We wanted rock solid automation in place to allow the entire team to be responsible for those releases, really the core of DevOps there. But to make this as easy as possible. So it didn't need to be senior engineers. It could be anybody that's just joined the team. They'd be able to handle a release, no problem. So the metrics that we actually defined as really our goals, those measurable goals, was the number of releases we could do, number of features that we could release, and how long it took us to do a deployment. So if we jump forwards to 2020, we've done about 530 releases so far this year. So very regular indeed, just over 2 a working day on average. We've released and shipped about 3,800 pull requests, about 250 in there that didn't get released. We sort of aborted, and that's what agile development's all about. But yeah, 3,800 pull requests shipped. And that's from a team of probably about 30 to 40 developers. And the deployment duration, the actual process, is a single click, a single script that we kick off. And it takes about 15 minutes to run in its entirety. It's just one click and doesn't really need monitoring, so that's quite nice. We do have a project going on at the moment to reduce that to 5 minutes as our goal. And that's what we measured so far and sort of the improvements that we've made. When we look at this list, you can see that for us, the goal was very clearly the speed, the velocity, the agility, and that's essentially the only thing we were tracking internally. That was our primary outcome that we were aiming for. We do monitor other things, how often we ship bugs, how often we need to do rollbacks, a few other things, but in reality, for us, speed is the most important. We spoke before about other industries, financial, healthcare, those sort of heavily regulated industries. In those industries, I suspect that your outcomes are going to be much more targeted towards reliability, review, and compliance. Those are going to be the goals of your DevOps process, and that's absolutely fine, as long as you have that set out clearly from the beginning. Then you'll be on the right track. There's a whole blog post that you can find on our website, which covers in depth our process. So just one to dig into if you're interested. The full process that we have, I guess full development process, not just a release, is more or less listed here. Essentially 5 steps. The development and code review. It's a manual process. We use GitHub. So the red traffic light, as it were, indicating that is a manual process for us. Reviewing everything manually is obviously important. It's essentially our code quality stage, more or less. We have automated testing and deployments out to staging. We use continuous integration there. So that piece is automated. We've got the green light. For us, testing is fine to do manually. The app isn't massive. We can test the primary function of it relatively quickly and relatively easily. The interesting piece here, though, is that it may make sense for you to automate that. It doesn't for us at the moment. It might do in the future. but it could for you. So consider something like Provar or Selenium, and you can get the automation here. Just about addressing those requirements for us. It's not huge. It's currently still a manual process, and it isn't part of our goals or outcomes at the moment to change that. We've got our pre-checks, which happen. That is automated. That checks that everything has been manually tested, essentially. And then the release is automated as well. Just that one script to run. It's all orchestrated by Kubernetes, so it's nice and quick. The real lesson and goal, I guess, from this is that we don't automate everything. You can have manual pieces that fit into an automated process where it doesn't make sense to invest in that automation, where it just won't save you that much time. This is a little diagram. I won't spend too much time on it, just so we stay on track time-wise. But this is actually how we manage to release the app with no downtime whatsoever. Essentially, we run 2 versions of Gearset with a load balancer that distributes our users. We push everybody onto one instance of Gearset. We update the other, as you can see here, and then we move all of our users onto the updated version. A really nice, simple system. Unfortunately, it's basically impossible to do on the Salesforce platform. So for you guys, it isn't a solution you can implement, but it's just a sort of point that's interesting for how Gearset operates. We're one of the few tools that isn't built on the Salesforce platform. Other tools will be, installed into your org as a managed package. We don't do that so that we can do this, so that we can deliver quickly. I think it's a neat solution, and it's been working very well for us. So we went through all this process, all this development, commitment, and time. What was the actual tangible value that we got for our customers? And that's why we, do this really at the end of the day. So take a second to assess the value that we delivered. The first one is that we can roll back immediately. We use that load balancer. We shift everybody back to the old version. So if there is any kind of bug or problem, we can do that very quick rollback. It means there's no downtime. Customer requests, for features or bugs can be delivered the same day, especially bugs, small bugs. We can deliver fixes exceptionally quickly, and the lead time on features is essentially, half a day at most, waiting for the next release. That's very important. I mentioned before that releasing often means that your UI changes very incrementally and very steadily. You almost don't notice the changes. They're not disruptive at all. It's like watching a loaf of bread prove, is my analogy. It gradually grows and grows and grows, but you never notice it changing. Come back an hour later and it's doubled in size. That's really how this works for us. The other thing that's really important is that we can add support for Salesforce's API versions on the day of release. There's no lead time for that kind of support, and it keeps us immediately relevant based on Salesforce's newest releases. These are all genuine value points that our DevOps has provided for our customers. And they're things that you can, think about and focus to deliver to your end users as well. So we've got now to that important part, the implementation, the game plan to sort of set this up and for you to use, DevOps process internally. How are we going to go about it? So education is sort of the first great foundation. Obviously, down that route, attending webinars and so on. We've launched our DevOps Launchpad, which is essentially a set of courses very similar to Trailhead, really, with courses specifically around DevOps. It's completely free. Don't need to be a Gearset customer or anything like that. So just jump onto the website, sign up, and you can do the courses, get the badges. As I said, very similar to Trailhead, but specifically focused around DevOps. The other thing I would recommend doing before you do anything live in production with consequences is to sign up for free trials of all of these tools that give you that option. So you can create a Gearset account, a GitHub repo, get some Jira stories and tickets set up. Provar, I believe, for test automation, offer a free trial. You can set up DevOrgs in Salesforce in a few minutes as well. So all of these moving parts, you can set up free accounts, none of your organization's metadata or data, and you can try all of this. set up a full automated CI/CD workflow with some dummy data and gather that knowledge and experience before you try anything. Next up, I'd recommend you target those short-term wins. We talked about delivering value early on before. The first thing I would recommend almost to everybody is reducing that deployment time, the actual amount of time it takes you to do a release without changing your workflow at all. So if you use change sets, just drop in a tool like GearSet instead of change sets and don't change anything else. And just assess that improvement. It's really easy to do. It doesn't upset or disrupt anyone. Not really that much to learn or change. It very easily gets you moving forwards and working. So we've got the compare and deploy sort of UI here. Selecting components, you get shown dependencies, clear visibility of what's changing. You hit next and you deploy. It's very, very quick and easy. Saves you time and nothing else changes. I've just gone, as you can actually see here, from dev to staging. So just like I was doing a change set, but faster. The next thing that's really good to do is improve internal communication. We saw that DevOps is all about relationship between development and operations. Things like Slack integrations, deployment reports, email alerts. Jira is a great tool to use, sort of issue tracking software. Implementing that kind of process early on will make it much, much easier to get things going and to have good results along the way. You see some of the notification options that we've got here with email, text, Slack, Microsoft Teams, and Chatter. They just make it easier for those teams to work together, to collaborate and actually build a process that works for everybody, again, with that feedback loop internally. As we said before, give yourself that rollback option. There's going to be some changes. Look at some workflows, all sorts of things that could disrupt day-to-day. Give yourself a backup option, make sure you're covered, and then you can get going confidently, making big changes, knowing that you can undo those if you need to. Get some of those jobs set up, make sure they're running every day, and you'll be all set. So these are the changes that I implement as a first step when a customer is really under pressure. And in those scenarios, wholesale changes are impractical, and they're probably a bit irresponsible as well, especially with larger teams. You don't want to change too much. Really, my favorite thing to do is put in just a tool with no workflow changes at all. The reason I do this, and the reason I think this works, is that you end up in a which comes first, the chicken or the egg scenario. Lots of teams, they don't know how to do better DevOps with the tooling they have. They don't know which tool they need for the DevOps they'd like to do, and you're kind of immobilized by that. We put the tool in place first. You start to understand some of the benefits that you're going to get from it, and then it lines up. CI/CD or adopting Git becomes really easy, and then you can build on those foundations. And that's where we start to look at the long term. So we're going to start targeting, sort of be that visionary that the company needs to drive this forwards. I'd look at implementing additional tooling. It's going to be really helpful. Source control is the biggest one. If you're not using source control yet, it's something I'd really recommend looking into, understanding, building the knowledge on. It really will be the core of DevOps. It's more important than GearSet, I would probably say, for the vast majority of people. So that's huge. You really consider getting that involved. Jira, I've mentioned before, there's loads of other issue tracking software that you can use. Data migration, sandbox seeding, making sure that those dev environments are in sync would be important. Once you've got tooling and solutions in place, consider scalability. And this comes down to workflows and source control, essentially. We've done other talks, spoke at Dreamforce about choosing the right actual branching strategy for a growing team. So I think that's on YouTube somewhere. It's probably a good segue to follow one with afterwards. But making sure you have the right workflow to address an additional 10 users that pop up, 10 admins or devs to pop up tomorrow. What would you do? How would you implement that? How would you build in a parallel dev stream as well? If you suddenly, adopt Service Cloud, you haven't been using it yet, then how do you actually handle that? And planning for that's important. Also, you want to be conscious if there are any major changes coming to Salesforce and your Salesforce instance on the horizon. So have you acquired anybody? Are you about to get acquired? Is it going to be an org merge somewhere? As I said before, adopting a new cloud could really put a spanner in the works. And this is where we start to change. If we loop back to the beginning, we start to change goals, or we start to adjust metrics when these things appear. You've probably been going down one route, you've been making good progress. All of a sudden, you're merging with another org. That becomes your priority. Shift the outcome, change the goals, address the metrics to make sure that we can verify that we're delivering value on the business requirements. And then we can move forwards, adding in step by step the required processes that we need. Thinking about workflows it can get complicated. It's something that Gearset can help with by all means. So if this is the scenario or the situation that you've got to, as I said, there is the Dreamforce talk, which I think is on YouTube. But we can help with this as well. We drop these plans. We've got some standard workflows that work for most people, but we work with teams as well to really design the workflows that will suit their requirements. These will change over time, obviously, but don't be afraid to draw out these diagrams, engage with us, and discuss these, and we can really help put in place something that'll work for you. That kind of takes us to the point where you should be able to jump in and sort of enjoy the perks of DevOps. So as a quick recap, I'll start off with a vision, understanding where we're going by qualifying your starting point, targeting really specific outcomes and goals, and then reconsidering and reevaluating those goals and the value that they drive regularly. Then we address the value. So for the business, what are some easy wins that we can get from the get-go to confirm that we are indeed taking this in a route that makes sense for that business? Address any downsides, those considerations before you start, just to make sure they don't offset the value entirely. If they do, then hold off. There's no requirement to move this forward now. If the value isn't there or the downsides are too great, just postpone. Embrace hidden benefits, things like upskilling the team, really important. Make sure those are included in your sort of value considerations and propositions, and then protect your investment as well with those backups. And then for the implementation itself, get learning, start testing, test things out in those trial environments. Target the short term initially, talked about just drop-in changes, individual changes, let them settle, see what avenues open up, and then slowly add more functionality. Of course, as we're doing that, we're building towards a bigger picture, start working out workflows that are going to work for you, branching strategies and source control, any other additional changes or considerations that you need to make or put in place as you move forwards. All of this, of course, under that sort of scope of the agile methodology, just to make sure that at any point in time, if the feedback changes or the outcomes change or the situations change, that all of this, we start again and we go back to the vision and we work through it essentially. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. If there's any questions, obviously we'll stay on to take those. Before you go, at the end of the day, connect with me and Kevin on LinkedIn. If you've got any questions at all, we're more than happy to discuss. Email over any questions, your specific scenarios, that you're in. Send those over, and we can really dive into a discussion and create a free trial on Gearset as well to try it out. Have a look, see if there's any part of that DevOps process that we can help for you. There was one more question in the chat which came up at the beginning, a bit of a longer one. So I'll just take a moment to read that, make sure I address it before we run out of time today as well. If there's any more, fire them into the chat and I'll pick those up as we go through it as well. So a question from Kurt at the beginning, and feel free to add in context. But I think the question here is, I'm working with other teams, other consultants. It's not possible to have a gear set license that bounces between different clients, and therefore it can be tricky essentially to manage those different organizations. This is a situation that we're sort of well aware of, and we actually have a feature which we use internally, which allows you to move your team, your user, across all of those teams, and we use that for support and managing sales teams, demo teams. That will probably get released at some point, and that'll make this a lot easier for you. At the moment, the vast majority of our partners who work with lots of different organizations will create additional accounts for sort of short-term trials, essentially, to work with those partners. If they are running long-term projects on multiple teams, talk to us. I'll see what we can do for you. We may be able to duplicate a license or something for you, just so you can work more easily across those teams. Hopefully that answered your question. As I said, I think, to be honest, there's some new functionality coming out to move teams, which would be the most useful for you there. So keep an eye out in the changelog, and that should help. I'll stay on for a few more minutes just to pick up any last questions. But again, really appreciate everybody's time, and have a good day, afternoon, morning, wherever you are.